Yud Aleph, Os Ches. And now we just discussed the idea. Well, you know what? It's always helpful to do the little kitzer. It just gives us one line as a jumping point. And it says, Yamshich Yud Shabachri Yadel. We spoke in the last chapter, just to summarize the whole thing, that the Yud behind the Dalid represents the sphere of Yesod, which is called Kol B'Shamayim Ba'aretz, Kol Da'achid B'Shamayim Ba'ara. And that's the idea of Yaakov, who said Yeshli Kol. Yaakov was a kol bearer, which means he was always connected to his source. And then Rash, right? It says L'Rash Ein Kol, right? Which literally means the poor has nothing. But in our beautiful, super Hasidic way of understanding him, it means the Rash, which is really the Reish, the perverted form of the Dalid. What perverts it is that Ein Kol. It's lacking the Yesod. It's not connected to above. It doesn't have the Kol. Yesh li Rav, and then that's Esav, who's also, instead of Yesh li Kol, like Yaakov said, I have Kol. What does Esav say in place of that? Yesh li Rav, which is this idea of like I have abundance, but it means abundance of Gashmias, disconnected from the Ruchnias, and that's the actual cause of further and further arrogance and Yeshus on his end. Os Ches. Hine b'kedusha, nice me'os dalid hey. Okay, now in kedusha, there's a flow, right? There's a hemshich, and it says it doesn't end with the dalid. The dalid turns into a hey. Why? Because it's the next letter. If you'll notice, by the way, all these things are sort of we're going like in the order, like just like we said, the shin, the resh, and the kuf. When we were rejecting them, they were alphabetically one after the next, going from the back of the alphabet. And so too, the Dalit is now going to turn into the Hey. We're basically expounding from below to above. So there's a progression that if you accomplished Dalitness in your life, you achieved the level of Dalit, like Yaakov, Yeshli Kol, your Bittul, then you will become a Hey. That's your, like sort of your reward, the next step. One could basically say this is something akin to the difference between Hiskafia and Hishapcha, right? Hiskafia is an extreme form of bittul, right? And you're essentially making yourself a nullity, right? And so if you accomplish this to an ultimate degree, it could transform into a level of the hay, which is called Hishapcha. I'm sort of adding that, but it works. And he says, now, in the Sitra Achra, on the other hand, if you, again, go with the letter flow, you go from Shin then to Reish. What's after Reish? You go in the other way. Kuf, right? So if you are a Reish, then your unfortunate reward will be that you become a Kuf, right? The next step after the Reish is the Kuf, just like the next step after the Dalet is the Hey. And the Kuf is even worse than the Reish. Now, let's understand this. Start with the good side. Hey, Yesh bo gam kein os Yud, but milafanav. So basically, what is the Hey? It's nothing other than the Dalid, but the Yud, which was on the back of the Dalid, now sits in front of the Dalid. Literally, like if you're looking at a Dalid, its face is like sort of like its little beak sticking out there, and in front of that, right, and in that direction, there's a Yud, right? In other words, it's face to face with the Yud, as opposed to where it was before, which was back to back with the Yud. Can you visualize that? Yeah. Understand that? So now you got the same Yud, but it's face to face. And who regel hasmali the os Hey. And what is that face to face? It's basically the left leg of the Hey. Elashum lefana, but here the Yud is now in front of it, and we're going to speak about that at great length. This is now called a front to front, panim b'panim relationship. Whereas before it had what's called an achor ba'achor relationship. Where do we hear these phrases? Achor ba'achor, panim b'panim. Is that something familiar to you? Yes?
The bread? No, but...
The bread is also a...
the Aron HaKodesh?
The Aron HaKodesh. I'm still working on the original one.
Face to face.
Who was first back to back and then turned face to face?
Oh, Adam and Chava.
Adam and Chava, right? Even before the Kruvim.
Yeah.
That you have Adam and Chava. They were created, so to speak, like glued back to back, according to our Midrashim and Rashi. And then they were separated and became face to face. Obviously, the face to face relationship is much more profound, namely because they can now have a relationship, and more importantly, they can also have relations, which means they can contact the koach of the Ein Sof, and they can also contact the ultimate tainug, right? The idea of like relations is this Indian of tainug, and with together with the tainug is like reproduction. The notion that the essence itself can basically reveal itself, that a person can reproduce himself. There's no greater revelation than that. Right? If you think about the revelations that come off of you, your intellect, your vision, right, your emotions, you have like sort of like you emanate all these powers, but the ultimate power is if you would be able to reveal yourself. And that's the idea of the revelation of the essence, which is symbolized by having a baby, procreating. So that procreation relationship is the result of what's called a face-to-face relationship as opposed to a back-to-back relationship. It also is the source of tainug, physical tainug, but that's physical tainug is created like that by Hashem because it represents the ultimate spiritual tainug. Hashem's ultimate desire is to reproduce himself, right? Is that his essence should be revealed, and therefore, like it's the nishava kadosh baruch Hu, right? It says, why did Hashem create the world? For a taiva, right? Mamish, like a person has a taivas isha, right? He's taivas for a woman because that sexual taiva, that's the same word. That's the same word. Hashem desired, he created the world with a taiva, right? Obviously all in kedushin, high holy things, but that's because the essence, when an essence of a person comes out, it's the greatest taiva. And when does Hashem's essence come out? When he, so to speak, mates with the lowest world. And so that happens only in a face-to-face relationship with the world. When he's in a back-to-back relationship with the world, that they're not able to meet, which is ultimately still holy, as we're going to see, but it's a dalid relationship where the yud is behind the dalid versus a hey relationship where the yud is in front of the dalid. Right? So first of all, does everyone understand everything we just said? Daniel? Okay. You serious?
Yeah.
What, the actual dalid, the symbol of it? All right. Well, here, let me have the paper for a second, and if you have a pencil, you can just see it in your mind for a second. The shape of a dalid is that the yud sticks off the end of it, right?
In the back.
So it's the back.
How's that facing it?
Okay. It's not
The
facing.
hay
It.
is the one
facing.
It's not facing him.
The hay is the good goes in front of the dollar. So,
It's too early in the morning.
No, it's not. It's here. I can't see you. If just so you understand, Shimon. Yeah, everybody's good. You're okay. You don't have to be so dramatic. Just don't lean back. The dalid, right? You understand? The hay is sticking off the back, so that's called the back, right? Now, when you make a hay, where does the yud come? The yud is now sitting. If this is the dalid, the yud's over here. It's in front of it. They're face to face. So what we're saying is basically. We're talking about now if the dalid is basically the world, right? It's malchus. We said the dalid is malchus. So sometimes the world is doing a beautiful job of being bottled to Hashem, but it's not necessarily bottled in a way where it's face to face. Because Adam and Chava, they were still united when they were back to back. There's nothing bad about this back type of. This is not a paro back to back, right? This could lead to a paro back to back if like misconstrued. But this is still a back-to-back in Kedusha, right? So, which means that basically you're still clinging to the source, but you're not facing the source. There's not a total unification of the source. And what primarily the whole story that I was going into is when you're in a back-to-back relationship, the source is not having the ultimate pleasure from you because it's not uniting with you, because you only unite when you become face-to-face and you are now a hey. You understand? So when you're in a dalid, you're not uniting, and therefore there's not the ultimate pleasure. And why is that ultimate pleasure lacking? Because the intimate desire of Hashem is that he should actually fuse and become one and reveal his essence in this creation. That only happens when you get to the hay. The dalid, which is a back-to-back relationship, is a setup for that. You must start with the dalid in order to get to the hay. And that's the idea that you have not yet sort of enabled Hashem to totally unite with you and reveal his essence, but you're setting up for that because you're making yourself bittul to him, right? So it's sort of like the difference, let's say, between like engagement and marriage, one could say. Like, I'm ready to marry you, but we're still back to back, right? Okay, you following this?
Yes.
Okay. Baruch Hashem. It's a victory. So what we're saying here is that the dalis, on line 3, whereas the dalid, the yud is behind. And this is referring to a type of unification. There's two types of unification, which I just was mentioning, back to back, right? And front to front, the os dalid mekabim os gimel, shekadam elav. Now, what's the idea of suddenly the dalid? We're going to now bring in suddenly the gimel. And the reason for that is because what makes the dalid a receiver, because the word dal means poor, we said, is because it's in front of the letter gimel. What does the word gimel mean?
Gomel.
Gomel. Gomel chasadim, right? Gomel chesed. It means to give. Yeah. So this idea of gimel dalid hey is a very cool thing, right? It's basically the gimel gives to the dalid, the rich gives to the poor, and that creates the hay, which we'll soon talk about in a second. But the idea is that we see that the dalid is a receiver, because what's it receiving? It's receiving from the gimel, which basically the gimel now represents, we said before, it receives from the yud on the back of it. The gimel is essentially a similar thing. It's right, like what's above it, right? The godliness which is above it. But this is called a yichud achor ba'achor, because they haven't united yet. They're still two independent entities, right? But they're just sort of like about to have a relationship with each other. The poor is going to receive and is positioned to receive and is the fit kli to receive from the rich, right? So they're in a relationship which is called back to back. And again, why back to back? You see that the dalid is called back to back because basically the dalid is not facing the yud, but the yud is also called in the situation of back to back, as I said before, on a more spiritual plane, because the full essence of Hashem is not yet being delivered. So when you say something, when you say something is face to face, it's like you're giving it your all. There's like a kind of a metaphor going on here. When a person is showing face, right, then it means like they're giving it their all. And the idea is when Hashem wants to give off, shefa, there's essentially two ways he can do it, right? He can either go back to back or front to front. What does it mean when Hashem is not showing face? He's giving off only, so to speak, like an external revelation of himself. It means it's just a ray. You're not getting the essence of Hashem. He's not giving you the panim or the panemius, right? Yeah. And so therefore, again, his essence is not being revealed, only mere revelations. So that's called the back of the giver. And we see also the dalid, right? Its back is facing Hashem. And in a similar vein, even though he's done a certain level of bittul, he's trying to empty himself out and not make himself into a yesh. So he's accomplished that. But to say that he's, like, so to speak, completely transformed and become divinity, that hasn't happened yet. He's still a kli. He's still something like, he's still the receiver of the giver, which gives him some type of identity, which is there that he has to nullify in the first place, right? So that's also called the back of the receiver. Just like the back of the giver is the back of the receiver. Does that make sense? You sure?
So the gimel is the giver.
The gimel is the giver.
Which is basically Hashem.
But the gimel is the giver in a sense, yes, which is Hashem. But it's talking about in a sense where when the gimel is giving, before he's actually given and the transference has taken place, the gimel represents an external aspect of giving of Hashem. He's not giving over his essence, he's giving over rays of himself, right?
Not in the check, but the check hasn't been cashed in.
Something like that. Not a bad analogy, actually, right? And that's called a back-to-back relationship of unification. Whereas the os hey, the yud is lefanav. Now let's understand the other one. The hey, the yud is in front of the dalid, which means the face-to-face relationship. Yichud b'chinas panim b'panim, and this is zen naisa al yedei hatzedakah. And how does that happen? Through tzedakah, right? So in other words, now the tzedakah is given. When the tzedakah is given, you no longer just have a giver and a receiver. You now have something called a mitzvah, which has been done. Right? When the actual, let's say, check has been cashed, right? Then what takes place now is that Hashem has unified with the world. Because when a mitzvah takes place, this is Nishava Kadosh Baruch Hu. This is the tithe of Hashem has just been revealed, his ultimate innermost depths of his pleasure, right? Which is basically just like when a person gives seed, it's the innermost depths of his pleasure because he reproduces his very essence in this, right? So too, when a mitzvah is done, what does the word mitzvah mean? Tzav tzavachibur. It's a complete unification of Hashem's essence and the world. Anytime you do a mitzvah, and therefore, this basically transforms the receiver into now basically being united in one bond with divinity. He's not like now a world which is receiving from God. He and God are now one because they've been bound by this mitzvah to be completely fused together. Right? And why is that called tzedakah? So there's like a play on words here from the Arizal. He says in the Kisvi Arizal that tzedakah is tzedek hey. Sheme'os daled naisa hey. So basically the word tzedakah, right? The point here is that the word tzedek is another name for malchus. Right? The word tzedek is another name for malchus. So when you take tzedek and you turn it into tzedakah, which means it's not just righteousness, it's actually, which is like the ability to give tzedakah, but it's the actual mitzvah having been performed. The tzedakah has been given. Then you take the tzedek, which is the stam sphere of malchus, sort of in its dalid position, and it becomes tzedakah, i.e. you added the hey, you made tzedek into a hey, which means you turned the dalid, tzedek, into a hey. And therefore you've created the face-to-face relationship, and Hashem's panemius has connected with your panemius, and the whole point is that there's this now yichud, panim b'panim, and essentially God's essence is revealed on earth through the mitzvah. B'kamayim Razal, Gimel Dalid, Gamul Dalim, and as the sages said, when you give to the poor, Shadalid Makama Gimel, when the Dalid actually receives from the Gimel, Naisa Os Hey, from that it turns into the Dalid turns into a Hey. In other words, that's what it means. Tzedakah, Tzedek, Hey, is the Dalid becomes a Hey. When the Gimel gives to the Dalid, then the Dalid turns into a Hey. Becomes from a back-to-back relationship to a front-to-front relationship. That's the end of this concept in Kedusha. It's a little bit, I did my best there. Is everyone sort of following? Anyone have any questions on that? Okay. Now, we were talking about the Dalid, but we're also trying to really figure out what's going on with this Reish situation. Because when in the Sitra Achra, Naisemi Reish Kuf, it's something terrible happens, right? That if you're a Reish, which means you're starting from the Sitra Achra, then your next step down is the Kuf. The Kuf, Harihu Dome Betmunasu Le'os Hey, and again, you have this beautiful Hebrew language perfection that the Kuf is also looks like a hey. How do you make a kuf? You basically make like a reish, and instead of making the little left leg, which would be a yud, you just pull that little left leg all the way down, and you wind up with a kuf, right? So it's domet. It looks like the form of a hey. The difference is in the letter hey, the legs are equal, right? They're both cut off at the same line. Whereas the os kuf, haregel asmali hu rola lamata. In the letter kuf, the left leg goes down below the line, right? Avram, you catching the picture on this one?
The kuf goes below, and then what was the next letter?
I'm saying the hey, right? The 2 feet of the letter are on the same line.
On the kuf.
The kuf, the left leg goes down below the line, right? So what's the symbolism of all this? So the idea, first of all, that this foot of the kuf goes down, this is reminiscent of the pasuk, which is also often brought she'in ragleha yordos mavis, right? It says her feet dangle into death. This is referring in general to the idea of the klippas, right? Because when it comes to this, like the feet, we are now going to say that the 10 spheros, right, are called Adam Ha'elyon, the higher man, right? And so God basically, in the form of the supernal man in the world of Atzilus, it has feet, right? And the feet is basically the sphere of Malchus. But the Malchus, her feet can dangle into death, which means that light that comes out of Malchus, when it goes down into Bria and Yetzir and Asiya, if it's not going down in a front-to-front way, right? But rather it's only going down in like a paro type of way, where everything gets clouded and confused as it goes down, then it's called her feet dangling into death, because the divine light gets misconstrued and lost to the point that it shows up as klippas and things which oppose godliness. So this is all symbolized by that left leg of the kuf. Why is it coming all the way down? Because it's talking about like the descent of the divine light, which getting lost in the klippas. And that's called the Kane Hakuf. We're going to do a lot of wordplay here from the Zohar, Chassidus, so sort of stay on top of what's happening. So this left leg, which is the idea of dangling into the klippas, it's called the reed of the kuf. That's what the technical terminology for that left leg of the kuf. It's called the reed of the kuf because it looks like a reed, right? Now, where else do we see the concept of a reed and its association with klippas? This is what the sages said when Shlomo Melech, right, took his 1,000th wife, right, and she was an Egyptian princess who had not properly really converted with a full heart to Judaism, and she wanted to basically bring down the kingdom, right, because of Shlomo's fall through her. So it says that when he married her, Gavriel came out of heaven, Yarad Gavriel, the angel, V'na'at Kane B'yam, and he planted a reed in the sea, V'alabo Sarton, and a kingdom basically, or like an island basically sprouted out from it. What's that?
And now
Yeah.
with pizza.
V'nivna Krach Gadol, and basically a giant city was built on this little island. And it says, "Who made to Israel?" Rashi says, and what's with this big giant city? It was a city of pain and suffering for the Jewish people. Basically, it was Rome, right? Italia. Italia shel Roma, that's what Rashi says in another place. So basically, Rome was actually built in a day, right? In the moment of Shlomo's sin, this whole city basically, the reed was planted that ultimately built this city, right? And that's called the Kana, right? Oh, look at this. The reed shows up over here. That reed was not just any old reed. It was the Kana of the Kuf. It was the reed of the Kuf. That's what happened. Like basically, the Reish turned into a Kuf. Whatever negative things were going on with the Shlomo or with the Jewish people at that time, that we were acting Reish like, we took it too far and we made a Kuf out of the Reish, which means we attached this Kana of the Kuf, and it came down below the line, and it had horrible repercussions. It created our worst enemies. And of course, this could happen in your own life, right? Your Rome, chas v'shalom, could be built in a day, right? If you like, there comes a cutting point when you annoy God enough, you take your reish, your arrogance, and basically it creates a monster. It pulls down the reed of the kuf, and it starts to chas v'shalom breed negativity. And he says this is the kana of the kuf, hanaisa b'klippa v'sitra achra, which basically is where all klippa and sitra achra comes from. That her legs dangling to death, as we said before. V'zehu hameitzu Yisrael. That's really what was the pain for Israel. It wasn't the city. It was basically that we caused like this descent of godliness to go down below the line, right under the belt, and this is what caused our downfall. So how do we explain this in a manner of Chassidus? You thought we were learning Chassidus. No, this is the explanation according to Chassidus. V'hine Hagimel Kavim, I guess all we said before was sort of in the realm of the Arizal and Zohar. We're talking very mythologically. The Gimel connects with the Dalet becomes a Hey. It was all like kind of like Kabbalistic talk. He said, how does this sort of like psychologically relate to our avodas Hashem? That's what he means, Al Derech HaChasidis. So he says, Al Derech HaChasidis is the Gimel Kavim, the Os Hey, the three lines of a Hey. Hem Gimel Levushe HaNefesh Machshava Dibur Ma'aseh. They represent the three garments of the soul: thought, speech, and action, which goes very well with what we were saying before, because Malchus, which is basically this area of the Hay, right? When the Dalet becomes the Hay, they're both Malchus. The only question is Malchus receiving from the higher spheros, or has Malchus now been impregnated and enriched from the higher spheros? In which case it becomes a Hay, right? So when it becomes a Hay, this represents the three lines of the Hay are the thought, speech, and action, which basically cloak, which is like the worlds, uniting and cloaking with what's above it, right? Like in a certain sense, like you impregnate your thought, speech, and action with divine thoughts or with klippadika thoughts. So they're sort of like just like these empty vessels waiting to either be, filled with light or, God forbid, darkness. So these are called the three garments which represent the Hay. V'lechein kana hasmoli hu nifsak mashne kavin, and that's why even in the hay, we're not talking about the kuf right now. We're talking about in kedusha, the left side is not connected to the top and the right. Right? How do you make a hay? You make a dalid and you make a little yud on the left, but it's like in its own little orbit. It's not connected to the rest of the letter. And this is all because it represents the action in the thought, speech, action triumvirate, right? And therefore it's in a state of disconnect. L'oros, in order to tell us and to instruct us, that action is really in a disconnected world from thought and speech. And this is actually quite easy to understand in the sense that when you think something, the same letters that you're thinking, you can say, right? So it's literally one continuum. Like the thought and the speech are sort of like, they're different dimensions, because the thought is sort of like more spiritual in your head. The speech comes out in the breath and it materializes, but it's the same thing. It's just like a continuum from they're connected. Whereas action, which is also a garment, what is it? It's like its own little animal that pops out there, right? It's not like, well, I was thinking the letter Aleph and now I'm saying the letter Aleph and then all of a sudden I write the letter Aleph. It's really like it's almost like a disconnected thing, right? It has to come out in a medium which does not show itself bound up and joined to the other two. Make sense? Now, even though there is a distinction between thought and speech themselves, because thought is called a joined garment, whereas speech is called a separated garment. Avramo, one more minute. We're almost there. The class ends when it ends, not when that little gadget. Oh, you have to go to mikveh?
Yeah.
It's a Chassidish Yetzer Hara. Okay, so
the hardest one.
Yeah. So the point is that we're almost done. The point is that we're saying that the thought and speech themselves are very distinct from each other, because the thought is what's called a united garment, whereas the speech is called a separated garment. What is the meaning of that? Thought is called a united garment. Speech is a separated.
You say something and it's just out there.
It's out there, right? When you say something, it leaves your body.
The vibrations
Simple as that.
have left.
When you think, it's still bound up and one with you. So that's a huge difference energetically when something is still inside your body and fused with the with your soul, than something that's like mama ejects, right? And it like leaves your soul and it's like out in the ether somewhere. So thought is already extremely disconnected in a certain sense from speech. Therefore, thought is only to yourself, and dibur is to lezulas, whereas speech is to the other. Nevertheless, yes, they're different, but they're still like in the same world. They're comparable to each other, right? Because as we're going to say, the same letters that you think, you speak, right? They're basically a continuum. Where masha'enkin maisa hunifer, when you get into deed, it's not in the same continuum. It's not really comparable. It's incomparable to thought and speech. So even though thought and speech themselves are distinct, they're still relatively connected. Whereas deed is considered completely, unrelatable, and therefore there is a break between and on the left leg, and it's not connected to the rest of the os to indicate this phenomenon inside of our souls. Okay, we'll hold here.
Zaku Baruch.